Today in the EU, breaking down the jargon of European institutions.
This is the first time in human history that we have a true lingua franca for all, bad English.
If bad English is the language of the European Union, it's also because the building blocks of this language are acronyms, abbreviations, and insider references. But how can we understand fully European politics if we don't understand its vernacular? Hello and welcome. I'm Giada Santana, and this is Today in the EU. From Coreper to APA and Plux, ahead of the elections, we asked our newsroom to decode the most essential terms that belong to the jargon of the European Union to make what happens in Brussels more intelligible to outsiders and maybe insiders too. Let's kick off this episode by analyzing the acronyms that dominate our daily conversations. Max, the first that comes to mind is EUCO. What is EUCO?
EUCO means European Council. It's where, EU leaders, heads of government, heads of state meet to discuss more the strategic agenda of the EU, more the strategic level, but also to decide on key foreign affairs topics, such as support to Ukraine, for example.
People tend to confuse EUCO with the Council of the European Union. Let's explain the difference between the two.
In the Council of the European Union, you have the ministers of the governments that meet to discuss certain policy topics depending on the area, depending on the policy, on the proposal. Different ministers meet. So, for example, if it's to talk about the common agricultural policy, then it will be the ministers of agriculture of each country that meet to discuss that.
Aurélie, let's stay right here at the corner of Rue de la Loi, where the council is located. There are quite a few acronyms you need to know if you walk around this area. What are the ones that we should not forget?
3 ones come to mind when you ask me these questions, and these are Coreper, Mertens, Antici. They may not sound like a lot, but I think these are definitely ones to not be forgetting and definitely keep in mind and know how to use.
Okay, what about the first one?
Coreper stands for Comité des représentants permanents. So it is actually a French acronym, which sometimes is a bit difficult to understand in Brussels because a lot of people speak in English, but it turns out this one is actually a French one. And so it stands for the group of ambassadors. So the high-level ambassadors, the first ambassadors of all the permanent representations. It's a bit complicated in the EU, but basically the ambassador for the embassy to the EU of each country, each member state. And so they meet several times a week, and they're all called Coreper. And the most important of them is the Coreper 2, which is also a bit complicated to remember because Coreper 2 is more important than Coreper 1 in the ranking of the embassy.
Moving to the second is Mertens.
Yes. So, like I said, your ambassador of the permanent representation is called Coreper 1 and 2. And Coreper 2 is assigned a deputy that helps with the negotiations and behind closed doors and things like this. And this is an Antici. The Coreper 1 is assigned a deputy that is called Mertens. They are both named after people, actually, that have had an impact on the group. For example, Antici comes from the group's first Italian president, whereas Mertens come from the Belgian president of the group a long time ago. And now the names have just stuck. It's also, if you know about the third ambassador of each permanent representation of each embassy, which is the PSC, so the ambassador to the Political and Security Committee. They also have a deputy that's called a Nikolaidis, and this is also named after someone. It's a lot of acronyms to say you have one ambassador and they have a deputy, which is an Antici. And you need to know this if you want to be part of the bubble and if you want to know what people are talking to when you talk to member states representatives, it does help.
Right, so a ton of niche historical inside references, basically. One thing I couldn't really wrap my head around when I first came to Brussels was the term crunch time. I kept reading it everywhere and I didn't understand what that meant. Why do we say crunch time so much here in Brussels?
It's anything and everything, isn't it?
Okay.
You do hear it every time. It's a word that is often used by journalists and diplomats. We tend to think that the EU is always about to crumble, that then the member states will never come to an agreement, that the parliament is going to make everything fall, or the council will make everything fall after months of negotiations. It's not necessarily representative of actually how important a decision is. It is more representative of the fact that this issue, let's say, like, for example, you need to decide on budget. So you know that the summit to decide on the budget is on the 10th of June. And on the 10th of June is called crunch time, basically, because this is the day that is put on the agenda to decide that they will have to take a decision. Now, if they miss that date, it's probably not the end of the world, and they can probably come back to it at a later point. And also, it's what is used for like putting a lot of attention on those high-level decisions. But, it's like the white smoke or the 11th hour. It's the EU. They always come to a compromise, and it's just putting a lot of pressure on them at the end of the day.
Staying in the EU but moving outside of EU institutions, is there any other term that you think it would be useful to know?
There's one I like, which I find that whenever I talk to someone who's not in that bubble, it's always a bit difficult, is Rammstein. It's a bit difficult to explain to someone who's never heard of Ukraine support, maybe, because it's the name, well, first of all, of a band, a German band.
Rammstein.
It's also the name of the city where there's an army base in Germany. And it's the base where Ukraine supporters in the war against Russia have gathered for the first time to decide on coordinating their support, their military support, but not only that. It is officially called something like Ukraine Support Contact Group, something like this. It's UCDG. Anyways.
Something nobody recognizes.
Something no one knows what it's about. But also Rammstein as well, if you think about it. If only I were to explain, oh yeah, there's a Rammstein meeting. But in a way, it's stuck. And it's one that we always have to remember how to explain them. But it's also, if you don't know what it is, you can't really have a conversation maybe with people that are really involved in it, because then that's the way they remember it, is the first place where we met. It's funny how groups or institutions or people have marked history with how, it's like the Potsdam meeting, the Yalta conference, we just remember that because of who was there and when they met and why, and somehow it stuck with us.
Alex, we're 1 week away from G7, which means that there's going to be one acronym that we should explain, and that is Sherpa. What does Sherpa mean?
Sherpa usually refers to advisors or technocrats that are working behind the scenes. Usually it's in the EU context, so they're a personal representative of a head of state or head of government who prepares for an international summit. And the name is essentially borrowed from the Sherpa people in Nepal, which serve as guides and porters in the Himalayas. So the reference is to the fact that the Sherpas do all this heavy lifting for the principle to reach a summit. Right. And since I heard it the first time when I started in Brussels, I can't quite get the picture out of my head that they're walking around the corridors with their papers and folders and so on, and essentially walking after their representatives and doing the heavy lifting.
Mm-hmm. Another word is non-paper, right?
Yes, and it's actually every journalist's favorite because we're the ones chasing after those to report on them. But it's essentially an off-the-record or unofficial document, which has not been going through a formal procedure of adoption. So normally it spells out a specific position of one or more member states or an institution on a specific topic. And then it's distributed to other member states, to institutions, and it can essentially serve as an input for the drafting process of decisions or conclusions. And it is probably one of the key EU jargon words that we use without really thinking about them. But when you do think about it, then, it's something that exists but kind of doesn't exist. So it's a bit of a paradox on this one.
And the third one is confessionals. Now, I've heard a lot about confessionals growing up in Italy, but I don't think that quite revolves around that, right?
Well, no, it doesn't. But I think the idea is roughly right. So it's a type of meeting that is organized, for example, by the European Commission where a group of ambassadors share their views on a certain issue. And it's especially recently used when it comes, for example, to kicking off talks on a new sanctions package against Russia. So normally this takes place at the start of those negotiations. And the idea is that, assured of privacy, that member states will somehow unbutton and kind of reveal their secret hopes and fears of what should be in those packages. So in some way, it is to try and hear out what member states think at the early stage of the process. Essentially like a priest who hears out a person's confession, because ideally with the security that the information will not reach others. This is at least the idea. Well, we know that's not quite true because we do report on those issues, but that's roughly the concept.
Got it.
Do you want a Christmas tree?
I really do. Tell me, what is the Christmas tree?
So, I mean, it's a word that is often used by EU diplomats when you work on a joint declaration for an EU summit, for a G7 summit, or other things. But it's not really exclusive to that. Just it refers to member states wanting to add as many of their favorite talking points or wordings to a text. And just like the Christmas tree, when everyone adds their favorite decoration, in the end, you kind of risk that it might be a bit overloaded, messy, or too colorful when it comes to the text, so nobody can really agree on it. So that's the fear of many EU diplomats.
Let's forget the council for a second and take a walk to the parliament, often referred to as plaques here. Max, getting back to you, tell us, why is it called like that and what happens there?
Plaques means Place du Luxembourg. What happens at Plaques is that on Thursday evenings, people gather there to drink. Yeah, it's people from the parliament, APAs, even MEPs, but also people from the stakeholders around institutions such as, lobbyists, people in consultancies, NGOs, all of that. Basically, the bubble goes there to, relax a bit after a long week and celebrate that Friday is coming.
You mentioned two acronyms now as well, MEPs and APAs. What do they mean?
MEP means Member of the European Parliament. They're elected every 5 years. In fact, we're going to elect them very soon. And then these MEPs sit in parliamentary groups, in political groups inside the European Parliament.
MEPs don't do their work alone, though.
No, MEPs don't do their work alone. They have, of course, aides. They're called APAs, accredited parliamentary assistants. It depends. Some people have more, some people have less. Of course, it also depends on the amount of work that each MEP has, because some MEPs work a lot, have a lot of rapporteurships, they have leading roles, so they need extra help.
You're renownedly very passionate about the many names that bars in the parliament have, right?
That's one of the things that, first of all, surprised me the most. Second, confused me the most. And third, that I love the most about the European Parliament, because it just shows how, out of creativity or out of need also, to say, hey, let's meet in X place. People ended up finding these very random names to the different bars and cafes of the European Parliament.
And what are the names?
Yeah, so I know some, but I'm sure I don't know all of them. Also, the Parliament is huge. There's many cafes. So, for example, the first one I got to know was the Mickey Mouse Bar Cafe. It's the one right next to the hemicycle, and you might be wondering, why is it called Mickey Mouse?
Yes, why is it called that?
There's different explanations to it. One of them is because the chairs are very colorful and they have this, weird shape, so they sort of resemble Mickey Mouse. I don't fully agree with it, but well. Another reason is apparently because there's this painting of Mickey Mouse or some sort of mouse.
Okay.
Yes. And then the third one that could also be is that apparently Margaret Thatcher, former UK Prime Minister, referred to the European Parliament as a Mickey Mouse Parliament, as in a small club with no influence. So maybe that sticked. And I have an extra one.
Oh, okay.
Actually,
shoot.
that I hadn't told you before starting this podcast. But I won't say exactly what it is, because it's a little secret. A lot of people don't know about it, even if they've been working there for a while, because it's very hidden in a way. So it's called the Havel Cafe. But I'm not going to say anything else. I'm just going to invite all of our listeners to try to find out themselves what this Havel Cafe is. I'm just going to say this, that is the best spot, that a lot of people don't know about it, but also a lot of people know about it. In any case, I invite everyone to find out why this Havel Cafe bar is so special and why it's my favorite.
Recommended by Max Griera. I'm Jada Santana, and this was Euractiv's Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. Leave us a star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite streaming platform. It will really help us spread the word about our work. This episode was produced by Miriam Sanz de Tejada, Nicoletta Yonta, and me. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.